The Second World War ended in 1945, leaving millions dead and cities in ruins. Old empires crumbled and new powers rose. The end of one global conflict soon gave way to a new kind of struggle, the Cold War. Before the war, Britain, France, Germany, and Japan were great powers. The war changed this balance completely. Germany and Japan were defeated and occupied. Britain and France were victorious but weakened. Two countries emerged much stronger, the United States and the Soviet Union. They became known as the superpowers. The USA and the USSR had been allies during the war, but this alliance was one of necessity. The two nations had very different ideas about how the world should be organized. The USA was a capitalist democracy, the Soviet Union was a communist state. These differences became more important once their common enemy was gone. Mistrust and suspicion grew quickly between them. Each side feared the other wanted to dominate the world. This period after 1945 was not a traditional war. There was no direct large-scale fighting between the USA and the USSR. That is why it was called a Cold War. However, it was a period of intense rivalry involving political competition, economic pressure, propaganda, and an arms race. There were also hot wars in other parts of the world. These were proxy wars where the superpowers supported opposing sides. The Cold War created a climate of fear and tension that lasted for over 40 years. It affected every corner of the globe. The world was forever changed by this new kind of conflict. The Cold War was fundamentally a battle of ideas about how societies should be run. The United States championed capitalism and democracy. In a capitalist system, businesses and property are mostly privately owned. People are free to start businesses and compete. The economy is driven by supply and demand. The USA also believed in democracy, where people could choose their leaders through elections. They valued individual freedoms, like freedom of speech and religion. The Soviet Union, on the other hand, was built on the principles of communism. Communists believed that capitalism was unfair and exploited working people. In a communist system, the state controls the economy. Factories, land, and resources are owned by the state. The Communist Party held all political power in the USSR. There were no free elections in the Western sense. These two ideologies were entirely opposed and could not easily coexist. Each superpower believed its system was superior and saw the other's system as a threat. The United States feared communism would spread and saw it as a danger to freedom and democracy worldwide. The Soviet Union was deeply suspicious of the capitalist West and aimed to create a buffer zone of friendly states in Eastern Europe. This clash of ideologies created a deep divide, splitting the world into two opposing camps. This division was the engine of the Cold War. The battle of ideas shaped global politics for decades. After the Second World War, Europe became the first major arena of the Cold War. The continent was devastated and needed to be rebuilt. The USA and the USSR had different visions for its future. Soviet armies occupied large parts of Eastern Europe, including Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria. Communist governments loyal to Moscow were gradually installed. The United States and Britain were alarmed by Soviet actions in Eastern Europe. They had hoped for free elections and self-determination for these countries. Instead, they saw a new form of domination emerging. In 1946, Winston Churchill declared that an Iron Curtain had descended across the continent. This Iron Curtain represented the division of Europe into two hostile blocs. To the west were the democratic capitalist countries allied with the USA, to the east were the communist countries under Soviet influence. The division of Germany was a key part of this European split. Germany was divided into 4 occupation zones controlled by the USA, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union. The capital city, Berlin, was also divided. The Western powers wanted to rebuild Germany as a democratic nation, while the Soviet Union wanted it to remain weak or become communist. These disagreements over Germany's future would lead to many crises. Berlin became a potent symbol of the Cold War. It was a city divided deep within Soviet-controlled East Germany. West Berlin was an island of capitalism and democracy in a sea of communism. In 1948, the Soviet Union tried to force the Western Allies out of Berlin by blocking all access to West Berlin. This was known as the Berlin Blockade. The Soviets hoped to starve West Berlin into submission. The United States and its allies responded with the Berlin Airlift. For nearly a year, they flew supplies into West Berlin. The airlift demonstrated the West's determination to protect West Berlin. Eventually, the Soviets realized the blockade was failing and lifted it in 1949. Despite the end of the blockade, Berlin remained a flashpoint. Many East Germans were unhappy with communist rule and saw West Berlin as an escape route to freedom. In August 1961, the East German government, with Soviet backing, began to build the Berlin Wall. The wall became a stark physical symbol of the Iron Curtain. It divided families and friends and stopped the flow of refugees. The Berlin Wall stood for 28 years, representing the deep divisions of the Cold War. The Cold War was also a terrifying military confrontation due to the development of nuclear weapons. The United States was the first country to develop and use atomic bombs in 1945. For a few years, America had a monopoly on these devastating weapons. However, the Soviet Union was determined to catch up and successfully tested its first atomic device in 1949. This marked the beginning of the nuclear arms race. Both superpowers began to build larger and more powerful nuclear arsenals. They developed hydrogen bombs and long-range missiles. The nuclear arms race created a dangerous situation known as mutually assured destruction, or MAD. This meant that if one superpower launched a nuclear attack, the other would retaliate, leading to complete destruction. This terrifying prospect helped to prevent a direct war between the USA and USSR. However, it also meant that the world lived under the constant threat of nuclear war. People built bomb shelters, and children practiced duck and cover drills in schools. The fear of nuclear war permeated society. There were many moments when the world seemed to be on the brink of disaster. Both sides invested huge sums of money in their nuclear forces, and developed sophisticated early warning systems. Treaties like the Partial Test Ban Treaty of 1963 and the Non-Proliferation Treaty of 1968 were attempts to manage the danger. The Cold War was marked by several intense crises, bringing the superpowers dangerously close to direct conflict. One of the most famous was the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. It began when the Soviet Union secretly started to install nuclear missiles in Cuba. American spy planes discovered the missile sites. President John F. Kennedy demanded that the Soviets remove the missiles and ordered a naval blockade around Cuba. For 13 days in October 1962, the world held its breath. A nuclear war seemed terrifyingly possible. Secret negotiations took place between Kennedy and Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev. Eventually, a deal was reached. The Soviets agreed to remove their missiles from Cuba, and the USA promised not to invade Cuba. The Cuban Missile Crisis was a turning point in the Cold War. It showed both leaders how easily a miscalculation could lead to catastrophe. After the crisis, both superpowers recognized the need for better communication. A direct telephone link, the hotline, was established between Washington and Moscow. The crisis also led to renewed efforts to control nuclear arms. It highlighted the dangers of brinkmanship, pushing a dangerous situation to the very edge of disaster to achieve one's goals. Although the USA and USSR never fought each other directly on a large scale, their rivalry fueled many conflicts around the world. These were known as proxy wars. In these wars, the superpowers supported opposing sides with weapons, money, and training. The Korean War from 1950 to 1953 was one of the first major proxy wars. Communist North Korea, backed by the Soviet Union and China, invaded South Korea. South Korea was supported by the United States and the United Nations. The war ended in a stalemate, with Korea remaining divided. The Vietnam War was another long and devastating proxy war. It lasted from the late 1950s to 1975. The communist North Vietnam, supported by the Soviet Union and China, fought against South Vietnam, backed by the United States. The USA became heavily involved, sending hundreds of thousands of troops. The war was deeply unpopular in America and caused huge social and political divisions. Eventually, the USA withdrew its forces and South Vietnam fell to the communists in 1975. The Soviet Union also experienced its own costly proxy war in Afghanistan. In 1979, Soviet troops invaded Afghanistan to support a friendly communist government. They found themselves fighting against Afghan resistance fighters called the Mujahideen, who received support from the United States, Pakistan, and other countries. The war dragged on for 10 years, becoming a Soviet Vietnam. The Soviet army eventually withdrew in 1989, having failed to achieve its objectives. Alongside these deadly conflicts, the Cold War also spurred a different kind of competition, the space race. This began in 1957 when the Soviet Union launched Sputnik 1, the first artificial satellite. By the 1970s, there were some signs of a thaw in Cold War tensions, known as détente. The USA and USSR signed treaties to limit nuclear weapons, such as SALT I. However, détente was fragile and undermined by events like the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. In the early 1980s, tensions rose again. US President Ronald Reagan took a strong stance against the Soviet Union, calling it an evil empire and increasing military spending. The situation began to change dramatically in the mid-1980s. Mikhail Gorbachev became the leader of the Soviet Union in 1985. He recognized that the USSR was facing serious economic problems. Gorbachev introduced policies of glasnost, openness, and perestroika, economic restructuring. He sought better relations with the West and allowed more freedom in Eastern European countries. These reforms unleashed forces that the Soviet government could not control. Popular movements for democracy grew across Eastern Europe. In 1989, a wave of revolutions swept through the region. The most symbolic moment came in November 1989 when the Berlin Wall was opened. Communist regimes collapsed one after another in Eastern Europe. Germany was reunified in 1990. The Cold War was rapidly coming to an end. The Soviet Union itself did not survive these changes. In December 1991, Mikhail Gorbachev resigned, and the Soviet Union officially ceased to exist. The Cold War was over, but its legacy continues to shape our world.